This is the reality of Muhammad's life and the Quran according to the traditions. That's a very important set of words there. According to the traditions, this is the reality. Muhammad, in 610 AD, claims to be a prophet. From 610, for the next 13 years, he gets about 100 followers when he's preaching a message of peace. He's preaching a message of taking care of widows and orphans and worshiping one God, of coexisting with Jews and Christians and Sabians. For about 13 years, this is the message he's preaching, and he gets about 100 followers. Some of them are persecuted, a few of them are actually killed. During that time, though, he is peaceful, and he tells his people to be at peace. But then he goes to another city. And in that city, when he flees, and by the way, that's the changing point for the Islamic calendar. That's their AD and BC moment, when he flees to the city. When he goes there, he's immediately given rule over the city. And now he has people who can fight for him. And that very year, he starts launching raids on caravans. One of those raids ultimately becomes the first major battle that Muslims fight. And then for the next 9 years of his life, before he dies, he either personally participates in or deputizes 86 battles. It's more than 9 per year until he dies. So you go from peaceful to violence, and right before he dies, he composes, or according to Muslims, it was revealed the last major chapter of the Quran. Okay, so I want you to follow this chronology. 610 AD is when the Quran starts coming and he starts preaching Islam. 632 AD is when he dies and the Quran is over. The last major chapter of the Quran is chapter 9. It's not in order. The Quran's not in chronological order. So chapter 9 is the last chronologically, but it's towards the beginning of the Quran. It is by far the most violent book of the Quran. By far. This is the one that says, slay the infidels wherever you find them, lay siege to them and take them captive. This is the one that says, fight Jews and Christians until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel subdued. This is the one in chapter 9, verse 33, which says that Islam is meant to dominate all other religions. This is the one that promises Muslims who die in battle, chapter 9, verse 111, that if you die, you will go to heaven. The verse of the bargain. These are the final marching orders of Islam. Because shortly thereafter, Muhammad dies, and this is the last major chapter of the Quran to be given. This teaching launched Muslims into an unlimited series of battles. What do I mean by unlimited? I mean Muhammad didn't give them clear limits. He didn't say, stop fighting these people at this time, or once you've accomplished X, stop fighting. There were no limits such as this. Kind of like in the gospel where it says, preach the gospel till the ends of the earth. There's no limit at that point. Same way here. There was no limit to the violence. And for that reason, Muslims conquered, within 150 years, 1/3 of the known world. You have to picture this. From the shores of the Atlantic to the valleys of India, 1/3 of the known world within 150 years. Why? This was the perfect storm of teachings which launched them into this warfare campaign. That is the truth from the Islamic sources. Now, what we find is Muslims have never shied away from this. It was never an issue until the 20th century. Up until at least toward the end of the 19th century, when the Ottoman Empire began to wane, it was at that point that people started saying otherwise. But up until then, Islam's dominance was not anything that Muslims shied away from. Really, it was at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the end of World War I, where Muslims began to ask questions like, what should we be? What should our identity be? Now that we have really no global power, what should our identity be? Some Muslims started responding by saying, well, Islam is actually a religion of peace. And that slogan first was uttered in the 20th century. At least as far as the records share. Other Muslims, however, started responding in the other way. They started asking questions like, Allah promised us that we would be dominant. Allah promised us that we would have reign. What happened? And the question was answered by saying, we have fallen away from Allah. We have fallen away from what He has told us to do. One man in particular who was thinking along these lines is named Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb was an intellectual from Egypt. In fact, he went and studied in Colorado for a time. And he saw the way Americans lived. To him, it was very debauched. It was very carnal, not refined whatsoever. The music was unrefined. The comedy was unrefined. To him, it was just a very ungodly society. So he comes back to Egypt. And he says, what we need to do is to take back the power in this world from the West, which is capitalist, and from the East, which is communist. By this point, we're talking about the 40s. We need to take back the power from the world. How do we do that? By following Allah. We need to follow the Quran to a T. We need to follow the Hadith. These were the founding principles of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. And this man was the primary intellectual of the Muslim Brotherhood coming into the 40s and 50s. Let me repeat that. The founding principle of the Muslim Brotherhood is to follow Islam. Follow the Quran, follow the Hadith, because nobody else seems to be doing it. His principle, his emphasis is what then has launched what I call the Islamic Reformation. Muslims who try their absolute best to return to the Hadith and the Quran. That is the primary statement of groups like Boko Haram, which, by the way, the Arabic term for Boko Haram actually means the organization of those who wish to propagate the teachings of the Prophet. These are the founding teachings of ISIS, which has broken away from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, of course, from Osama bin Laden's efforts. Osama bin Laden gave a whole interview in 1999 saying, we're coming after you, United States, because you have suppressed Muslims in the East. We are doing this for the sake of our faith. And now, of course, we see ISIS able to radicalize people based on what? And we don't have to conjecture. We don't have to guess. Because ISIS puts out glossy magazines made by people trained in the West. Glossy magazines that call other Muslims in the West to become devout fighters, mujahideen, for the battle of the caliphate. And what are they doing in these magazines? They're appealing to young Muslims, particularly young Muslims, and their sensibilities of fighting for the sake of Islam. And they'll quote Muhammad, and they'll quote the Hadith, and they'll be the most consistent in quoting Muhammad and the Hadith. Now don't get me wrong, remember when I was taught that Islam was a religion of peace, we quoted the Hadith too, but we left out whole swaths. We didn't explain them, we kind of ignored them. These guys don't do that. They're willing to take a look at all of it and consistently interpret it. And what they're doing is leaning on centuries of Islamic exegesis to say, look, we always fought. You have fallen away. A lot of people ask me, they say, Nabeel, look at what ISIS is doing. They're killing other Muslims. Surely it can't be about religion. Time out. How does that logic work? When they kill other Muslims, they think it's because those Muslims are not following Islam properly. And that's exactly what they say. They say, you are not following the Quran, you are not following the Hadith, you are not representing Islam. And this process of calling people non-Muslim is called takfir. It's a very well-established Islamic tradition. So, considering all this, when we take a look at those people who say Islam is a religion of peace, are they lying? Are they lying? No, they're not. They're telling you what they believe. They're telling you what they've been taught. And they believe it in their heart, just like I did.